this video we're taking a look at our second theory, or second explanation for attachment, which is Bowlby's monotropic theory. And these are the key words that we're going to be coming across in this video. The idea that attachments are adaptive, social releases, critical period, monotropy, and the internal working model. So I would suggest that for each of these terms you have them written down with the definition, i.e. you're keeping a glossary. Okie doke, so first things first, Bowlby was inspired by Lorenz, inspired from Harlow, and he offered an evolutionary explanation for attachment. Bowlby saw attachment as evolutionary because it is innate and it provides us with a survival advantage. He rejected learning theory, as you can see by this quote here on the right-hand side, and was combining theories from Freud and ethologists like Lorenz, people studying animals. And so, as we'll learn, a lot of Bowlby's theories are psychodynamic, but more on that later on in the course. So Bowlby saw attachments as evolutionary because they provide us with some sort of survival advantage and are therefore innate. We're sort of hardwired in our DNA to form attachments. This is the best quote, I think, to sum up the entire monotropic theory. It is the idea that infants have an inbuilt tendency to make an initial attachment with one attachment figure, usually the mother. If you had to describe Bowlby's monotropic theory for 1 or 2 marks, this would be the best way to do it. But it requires an understanding of various elements of his theory. So we're going to start off by looking at attachments being adaptive. By this, it means that attachments increase our chances or promote survival in humans. Attachment behaviours have evolved and endured because attachment promotes survival. Attachment to caregivers, and vice versa, gives our species an adaptive advantage. It makes us more likely to survive, because attachments encourage proximity and learning and sort of safe base exploration. So it really encourages behaviours that keep an infant fed, safe, warm, and close by the caregiver who can provide protection from danger. So the first element of Bowlby's monotropic theory is that attachments are adaptive because they provide humans with a survival advantage. The next key term, and the really important part of Bowlby's monotropic theory, is this idea of social releases. Babies display what are called social releases, which unlock the caregiving of adults. They are innate behaviours that encourage innate responses. So babies are born with a whole set of physical features, the typical baby face, the big eyes, the small noses, the chubby cheeks, really soft skin. All of those features and all of their behaviours, like crying and cooing, basically unlock caregiving from adults. They activate adult social interaction, and adults are hardwired to respond to these social releases. So in this respect then, attachment is reciprocal. Infants display these innate behaviours and innate features, and they in turn encourage innate caregiving responses from adults. So it's this reciprocal relationship where everything is innate, i.e. it's unlearned. The next key element is this idea of a critical period, which we've come across before in Lorenz's research, and Bowlby was inspired by Lorenz's research. Bowlby thought that babies have to form an attachment with their caregiver during the critical period. This is a window of opportunity, a window of time in which infants can form an attachment. Otherwise, they're going to find it much harder to form one later. There might be consequences down the line if this attachment doesn't take place between birth and 2.5 years of age. Bowlby thought that infants were maximally sensitive, so most sensitive, at around 6 months. And if they don't form an attachment by 2.5 years, between 6 months and 2.5 years, then there's going to be consequences socially, emotionally, intellectually, physically. And we'll look at that more in his next theory, in Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. So the critical period, just like in goslings, also exists in humans according to Bowlby's theory. We now move on to look at the idea of monotropy. Mono meaning one, and tropy meaning tending towards. So tending towards one person. Bowlby believed that infants form one special attachment, and this attachment is more important than all of the rest. And this was usually with the mother. So we've got a bit of a hierarchy of attachments, with the mother at the top and then secondary attachments, perhaps to the father and grandparents underneath. But it is generally the mother at the top. And this attachment, this intense, special, highly pleasurable relationship is known as monotropy, because we form one attachment to one very special person, which is usually the mother. And what's critically important is that this relationship, this monotropic relationship, forms the template for all future relationships. It generates and forms the internal working model. So an infant forms an internal working model. It is basically a schema for relationships. We've spoken about schemas when we've looked at eyewitness testimony and leading questions. A schema is really sort of a mental representation. It contains all of your thoughts and feelings, and it is basically like a cookie cutter. This is the template that is then going to dictate what your cookies look like later on. In this case, a template that's going to dictate what your relationships look like later on. So the internal working model is a model of relationships that we all possess. And it is based on that relationship with our primary attachment figure, i.e. that special attachment to our mothers during the critical period. And this serves as a really important template for future relationships. So it's a schema that the child forms for forming future relationships. And it basically consists of all of the rules and expectations that come with relationships. So, what does this really look like? If infants are securely attached to their caregivers, so the caregiver has provided sensitive responsiveness, lots of opportunities for interaction, they're loving and caring, then the infant is going to form what's called a secure attachment. A securely attached infant is going to grow up to be emotionally secure, trusting, confident in childhood, in adulthood, in romantic relationships, and as parents themselves. So attachment quality is transmitted from one generation to the next. So it's likely that securely attached infants will grow up to be parents that also have securely attached infants. On the other hand, insecurely attached infants, so this can come from a variety of reasons. We're going to look at secure and insecure attachments later on in this topic. But children who form an insecure attachment in infancy to their caregiver tend to form insecure attachments in their adult relationships. And this can mean that they find themselves not being drawn into relationships. They might find themselves being very, very independent and not seeking any positive feelings for being in relationships. They might be clingy and very jealous and very sort of unlucky in love. So insecurely attached infants will go on to be insecurely attached adults in childhood with adult relationships, and their children are also likely to form an insecure attachment. And we do see this happening over generations. So the internal working model is a schema for relationships that is based on that first special monotropic relationship, usually to our mother. It sort of sets the scene, if you like. It creates that template by which then all of your relationships will be very, very similar to this one. Working, this term here, implies that it's sort of a work in progress and that it develops over time. It doesn't change substantially, because this would create confusion and you wouldn't feel like the world was a stable place. And we generally develop stable internal working models unless there are major life events or changes within the family structure. So what I mean by this is that although working implies that it is developing over time, generally, if you have a secure internal working model due to a secure attachment to your caregiver in infancy, then that is likely to then transfer throughout your whole life, through childhood, adolescent, adult relationships, and relationships with your children, unless something really drastic happens. Likewise, insecurely attached infants will tend to stay insecurely attached in all of their later relationships unless something happens, unless there is a major life event. So that is really the main aspects of Bowlby's monotropic theory. Lots of keywords for you to remember, but it can be best summarised here. Infants are innately programmed to become attached to one person, usually the mother, and this is the idea of monotropy. This happens through them displaying social releases. for example, cute baby features or crying. As attachment provides an adaptive advantage to humans, it increases our chances of survival. Attachment is a biological process, and it takes place during the critical period from birth to 2.5 years. And if it doesn't occur, there are likely to be long-term consequences and difficulties forming attachments later. That primary attachment, that monotropic attachment developed in infancy, helps to form the mental template called the internal working model. And this mental template is the template for future relationships, and it tells us that securely attached infants will develop into trusting, loving adults, and insecurely attached infants might experience difficulties in later relationships through childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and with their own children.